I'm Jay Belsky. I'm a professor of human development at the University of California, Davis. My special expertise is in the study of children and families, and in particular how early developmental experiences and environmental exposures influence or fail to influence how children and adolescents develop over time and even into adulthood. When it comes to contexts of development that shape children's behavior, especially in what we call a negative way, antisocial, aggression, uncooperative, there are many. It's almost like there are many ways in which things can go wrong. We can begin with pregnancy and prenatal stressors, parents who are highly anxious or depressed or subject to stressful life events, be they things like earthquakes or just marital conflict. Of course, once the baby's born, we have how parents behave. Is it sensitive and responsive, or insensitive, neglectful, even, God forbid, abusive? What will matter also is what the quality of the relationship is between the mother and the father, in particular if there's lots of conflict. That's the kind of thing that could undermine long-term well-being as well, in part by undermining the parent-child relationship. Parents' mental health is going to matter a lot here too. Again, depression, anxiety, hostility, the more of that, the harder it is going to be for that parent to be sensitive, responsive, and available to the child. As we move out of the world of the family, why we probably shouldn't neglect, siblings who are aggressive. But as we move outside the world of the family, we've got to think most notably about daycare. And that becomes an issue of, is the child spending long hours from a very young age in child care, at least of the kind we have in the USA, which is not all of high quality. And then that raises the issue of what is the training and the skills of the people taking care of the child outside of the family. Are they neglectful? Are they abusive? Are they attentive? Are they intellectually stimulating? That's going to matter. And of course, then the child will go to school. And here we have issues of how safe and secure is the school, how friendly or not are the other children in the classroom, how skilled, capable or not are the teachers. And then there's the broader neighborhood setting. Is it safe and secure? Is it violence prone? Is it chaotic? Is it dirty? Is it more generally unsafe? And we can't lose sight of even the broader society. Does it provide adequate nutrition for its children? Does it provide adequate health care? When it doesn't, children's development is compromised. The big point here is that children are embedded in a set of kind of almost like nested Russian dolls. The pregnancy is in the family is in the community is in the society. And at all those multiple levels of analysis, things can go right or wrong. And when they go the wrong way, then children behave in ways that we describe as negative, that we don't like. My own feeling and my own take on it is that these ways of behaving, or we call them disturbed, dysregulated, dysfunctional, and disordered, are actually strategic adaptations, not consciously selected, that help fit the organism to the environment. If you've been an abused child, for example, being prone to aggression, being highly sensitive to detect threat in your environment really makes a lot of sense. Haven't you learned to hit first and ask questions later? Haven't you learned not to trust others? We have this tendency to think of these as pathologies when actually they're strategies for coping. I don't think that means we don't attempt to change that, but I think it means we reconceptualize how we understand those ways of functioning. Well, when it comes to wanting to improve children's well-being, all those variety of contexts become handles or targets to aim for. So in the same way that problematic functioning is multiply determined, the solutions to problematic function are multiple. Are pregnant women getting sufficient nutrition? Can we inhibit or stop them or prevent them from smoking? Can we ensure that they eat well? Can we ensure or help them feel less anxious and less depressed? Can we reduce the amount of conflict and threat in their lives? So that's one strategy even before the baby's born. Afterwards, there are a variety of intervention strategies for, if you would, tuning up or promoting more sensitive, responsive, involved care. That is everything from teaching to showing, and there are just many ways of doing it, but there are great possibilities there. By the same token, when the child goes into child care, we can ask, Are there ways to improving the quality? Are there ways to promoting better peer relationships? And there are. And certainly and the same goes for schooling. And certainly at the societal level, we could have policies that, protect and serve children much better than we currently have. Take family leave. In America, we give parents of newborns 3 months that they can stay away from work and not lose their job if they work in a big firm. Lots of people don't work in big firms. In other countries, people get a whole year of leave, and it's paid. And those are places where there's much more safety and security and support for the well-being of children, because in those places, children are much more seen as somebody that belongs to the community and the society, not just the parents. And so we look in those places to the community and society to provide nurturance and support, and not just parents. In America, we leave parents more or less on their own to cope. And it's only when things go awry that then we bring in services. Well, everybody knows that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So the question becomes, why are we so stupid? A central message I would like to convey is it's not just that all children are affected in the same way by particular experiences and exposures. And it's also not just, which we've long thought, that some children are more vulnerable to adversity. That is, when they face challenges and stresses, they're more likely to succumb, whereas other children are more likely to be resilient and not succumb to those adversities. In fact, my argument is that we have our children who vary in their general developmental plasticity. That is, some children are highly developmentally malleable and shaped by their early experiences. Other children are much less developmentally malleable and not shaped by their early experiences. And what's especially fascinating is that ever more research seems to suggest that the children who are most vulnerable to adversity, who do the worst when things go bad, do the best when things go good. They have a wide range of reaction. So they're affected by their experiences and their exposures, for better and for worse, depending if they're supportive or lack thereof. Where other children are more like what I would call fixed strategists. And again, I use this word strategy very generally. There's no choice here. But these fixed strategists go down the road of being who they are up to a point almost no matter which way the wind is blowing. So some children may, because that's the way they are, be and stay very nice, very friendly, whereas others may be and stay very aggressive. Some may be and stay very active. Some may be and stay very passive. Where other children, those phenotypes, those ways of developing and functioning, are going to be influenced much more by their experiences and their exposures. Okay, so an interesting question becomes, why are some children so much more malleable and responsive for better and for worse, and other children are less so? I think both nature and nurture play a role. We see evidence that there's genetic differences between these groups of children. So some children are born, it looks like, more susceptible to what happens to them and more likely to be shaped by their experiences and exposures, where other children, for genetic reasons, seem less so. Having said that, there also seems to be evidence that experience can promote this developmental plasticity and malleability. In other words, it can be fostered and promoted by experiences. So it can I almost think that when it comes to developmental plasticity, for some people who are highly malleable, they're born that way. For other people who are highly malleable, they're made that way. And by the same token, when it comes to people who are not very highly malleable, some people are born that way and some people are made that way. And you know what? That's probably true of every developmental characteristics we can think of. We have two people who are aggressive. We have two people who are nice. We have two people who are highly active. We have two people who are very studious. One of them in each case might have just been born that way, has the right genetic background or the wrong genetic background, whereas the other was made that way by their influences. So there become almost two different pathways, a nature pathway and a nurture pathway for each developmental outcome or phenotype. When it comes to the issue of biological determinism of bad behavior, or good behavior for that matter, I think there's real truth to it. But it's also the case that very few things are exclusively determined by one source of influence. Most of how we are multiply determined. So in fact, think of it this way. We've got two people who inherit the identical genes that seem to be implicated for increased risks of violence. One of them grows up sadly, in a violent family. The other one, let's imagine they're identical twins, in fact. The other one gets adopted into a nurturing family. It's probably the case that the first one, who's got the double whammy, a bad genes, so to speak, and a bad rearing environment, is going to become that problematic child down the road, where the other one is going to be protected from that in all likelihood. So we see here not so much genetic determinism, because the two kids are genetically identical, only one of them turns out, quote, bad. But we certainly see genetic influence and susceptibility. So if you see a child who, through no fault of his own, inherits a genetic background that predisposes toward aggression, and that child, again, through no fault of his own, grows up in a really hostile, abusive, or insensitive and chaotic environment, and the question becomes, when that child grows up and commits, a crime of violence or aggression, whose fault is it? And it seems to me entirely saying the child has individual freedom of agency and therefore responsibility is underappreciating the nature of development. Now, I think if the only thing, so my way of looking at this is that if you want to adjudicate responsibility, you need to look at more than just, is this person carrying genes, in this case, that might predispose the person toward violence? Because it looks like that in and of itself is maybe necessary but not sufficient. Now, if the child also grows up in a bad environment, well then, could many of us swim up that stream? And if, I'm always asking myself in these situations, if I walked in his or her shoes, would I be any different? And I think I would be. And I think if they walked in my shoes, that is genetically and environmentally, would they be different? And my answer is probably so. Well, if that's the case, what does that say about free agency and responsibility? I think it says we might exaggerate it, and we might think too much of it for ideological, cultural, and philosophical reasons. And we would do well to recognize that we are not entirely free. I mean, did any of us choose to be born and live in the 21st century? Did any of us choose what religion we would grow up with? Did any of us choose whether we would grow up with good nutrition or bad nutrition? Well, those things shape us hugely, but we didn't choose them. So why then do we think that we have unlimited free agency in all places? My new awareness and my insight is that the degree to which the environment shapes us varies greatly. And it varies in part as a function of our genetic background. So some people, for genetic reasons, are predisposed to be shaped, for better or for worse, by their developmental experience and exposures. Other children who have the same developmental experience and exposures, but for genetic reasons are just much less responsive to them. So here we have two kids, and we kind of see this already within families. That is, you will have two kids who are biologically related. They both get beaten, let's say, or they both get nurtured, but they don't turn out exactly the same, because one of them must be maybe much more susceptible and sensitive to their experiences and their exposures, where for others, it's kind of more like water off a duck's back. Or they may be affected in the short term, but it doesn't get under the skin, it doesn't affect who they become. They feel the pain of being beaten, but they don't carry that legacy to the same extent, whereas others also feel the pain of being beaten, but it shapes who they become much more. So I think, therefore, in the same way we see people as different for genetic reasons, in their aggressiveness, in their height, in their hair color, in their friendliness, in their activity level, in their physical coordination, we need to think about people as being different also, or varied, in how much their developmental experiences influence who they become. And for some it's a lot, and for others it looks like it's much less. And let me just add one thing. That kind of variation in what I would call developmental plasticity or malleability or environmental sensitivity or environmental susceptibility, we see in other species too. So then it becomes an interesting question. Why don't we see it in our own? And here's an intriguing observation. I said earlier that it looks like not just that some kids are more vulnerable to adversity, more likely to succumb if they're beaten as children, or they were reared by a depressed mother, or reared in a home of an alcoholic father, or others, the same exposures, that doesn't happen. And so we call the first set of children vulnerable. And so we have a word that reflects the likelihood of doing badly in the face of adversity. That's vulnerable. And those who are less likely, we think of them as resilient. Well, here's an interesting question. What word would you use to describe people who are disproportionately likely to benefit from enrichment and support? I've asked this question around the world. Languages don't seem to have a term for that. We have disproportionate likelihood to succumb to adversity, i.e. vulnerability. Disproportionate likelihood to benefit from enrichment, we don't seem to have a word. And I think as a result, perhaps, that's why we've long, for 40 years of me being in this business, have long understood that some kids are more likely to succumb to adversity, but have not appreciated that the very kids who are most likely to succumb to adversity are also most likely to benefit from enrichment. And by the same token, well, we like to herald the wonders of resilience, so that even though you've grown up with an alcoholic father or a depressed mother or facing child abuse, you haven't been affected. Those resilient children don't seem to be affected as much by nurturance and enrichment. So it's intriguing, we don't seem to have a word to characterize some children who are disproportionately likely to benefit from support and enrichment. And the only one I come up with is lucky. Unfortunately, they're unlucky if they grow up under conditions of adversity, because then they succumb to that. Right. So what they are really is developmentally plastic. And what's so interesting is, to me, the human capital cost when a child with that much malleability and that much developmental possibility grows up under adversity. Because that child, under other conditions, instead of costing us as a society and himself and his family and his school and his friends, etc., could have been a Steve Jobs.
Right.
Under the right conditions.
Yeah.
So just stop and think of the human capital cost, that we've turned a person who could have been a huge contribution to society, a great tax generator because of productivity, into a cost center who is a tax consumer.
Yeah.
Again, letting children grow up under those conditions and wasting that human capital seems to me just fundamentally stupid. But you know what? That's not the reason to protect children from adversity and bad conditions. And I think too much developmental science and public policy these days treats children as commodities. That is to say, we should, quote, invest in them and provide services so they develop better over the long run. No, that's fine as a secondary argument. The first argument of why you care for children is because they never asked to be here, and they have it coming in an affluent society that every child should have a decent quality of life. We shouldn't have children in any affluent society going hungry, going homeless, being cold, being frightened. That's just, to me, a moral failing of a society. And I think we need to reshape our discourse about disadvantaged children in terms of our moral responsibilities and their human rights, not simply in terms of long-term costs and benefits. Because the risk of long-term cost and benefit analysis is what happens when we do supposedly beneficial things, but they don't benefit. That is, they don't have the good consequences we expected of them. Then when we stop doing them, well, what if we discover you can put a child in a closet 3 days a week and it really won't hurt his eventual productivity? Do we put a child in a closet 3 days a week? Or what if we discover that being attentive and caring and affectionate and making children have a nice quality of life today has no developmental consequence for them tomorrow? Do we stop doing it? I don't think so. Because I don't think we show affection and we love and we care for our children just because of some payoff down the road. I come back to, they never asked to be here. They have certain rights and privileges as a result, or at least they should. And in this society, in America in the 21st century, it's clear we're not realizing our responsibility for taking care of them. You know, as those people who rail against abortion get criticized for, if you think it's so important to preserve a human life as an embryo, as a fetus, then you have an obligation to make sure that there's a decent quality of life thereafter. And when you play both sides of that argument, I can respect it, even if I disagree with part of it.
You know, I have a question that's a little bit
Go
to
for
the side
it.
of this. And if you don't want it recorded, that's fine. The thing is, I've always wondered about the kids who were the survivors in the Holocaust.
Me too. Me too. I wonder about the same thing. I wonder about the same thing.
Now, the people in the camps were adults, but the children all had to be taken away from the parents.
Yeah.
They had to be hidden. They had to be. They had
Whatever.
to stay quiet. I mean, we were hearing a story of a survivor last night who couldn't go out of the house. He was 2 years old. He couldn't go out of the house.
Had to be quiet.
He had to be quiet. He had to be, what about, I mean...
Well, it's
what
probably
about
the case for the children in the Holocaust who were hidden away. Probably some were more successful at it than others because of their temperaments and their dispositions. That if you could be quiet, if you could be inactive, if you could accept being alone, if you could accept being with people who are initially with strangers, if you could accept being apart from your parents, then you probably had a much greater chance of enduring. But we also have children who are highly active through no fault of their own. That's just who they are. Who are easily subject to distress. So when separated, they're going to act out a lot more. Who are much more wary and anxious about unfamiliar people. But those children were probably less likely to survive or not get caught. Or probably you could imagine that those who are willing to take in children found that this is a child I can't take in because he threatens the other children. And that's a tragedy. But by the same token, I always wonder about who survived the Holocaust and those horrific conditions. I keep thinking that, I'd be a person who just would have rolled over and said, better be dead than frozen all the time and starved and whipped and God forbid what else. But some people had the fortitude to withstand it. Now, Viktor Frankl argued it had to do with man's search for meaning. And the survivors were those who could find meaning in this horrific experience. I'm not so sure that's a full explanation, but it's an interesting one. And there are two reasons why, sort of, if you would, individual and family, quote, dysfunction get perpetuated across generations. And they're not mutually exclusive, and they no doubt interact. One is that I am an antisocial person who takes advantage of others, and I have a genetic background that leads me to be an opportunistic advantage taker. So I have children, they inherit that. I marry somebody or have a child with somebody kind of more than less like that. So our children get the double whammy. Our family doesn't function very well. We're just all kind of realizing the genetic regime that we're predisposed to in one generation and the next. So that's one pathway. Another pathway is much more psychological, developmental, environmental, which is that, my family that I grew up with is chaotic and violent and insensitive and uncaring. And that's how I learned to treat people. So when I have my offspring, guess what? That's how I treat my spouse and that's how I treat my children. So what do they learn? The same thing. And they pass it on to the next generation. Yeah. Now, this is probably most likely when you have both the environmental contributor and the genetic contributor. Because then you're almost locked into that intergenerational transmission. And that becomes a real challenge for service providers to break that cycle, because now they're working against the environmental wind and the genetic wind, and that's a bloody hurricane.
Yeah.